67%. That is the percentage of children under the age of 5 in the United States who spend a significant portion of their waking hours in some form of non-parental care. Daycare, a family member, a nanny, a home care setting, 67%. And virtually none of their parents have ever seen the brain data that researchers have been quietly accumulating for the last 2 decades about what that environment does and doesn't do to a developing infant nervous system. Not because the data is hidden, not because it's contested, but because nobody translated it into language a parent could actually use. Until now. What I'm going to show you in this video is not an opinion about daycare. It is not a judgment about working parents or stay-at-home parents or any decision any family has made. What I'm going to show you is what the neuroscience actually says. And it is different in several important ways from what the loudest voices in parenting culture have been telling you. And there is one finding in particular, documented by researchers at the University of Minnesota and replicated at 3 independent institutions, that changed how I think about this entire question. That finding is coming, and when it arrives, I think you will understand why it doesn't get talked about enough. Before I get into the data, I want to ask you something directly. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from and how old your baby is. And then tell me this, is your baby in daycare, at home with you, or somewhere in between? And whatever your situation is, has there been a moment where you genuinely wondered whether it was affecting them? Where you looked at your baby and asked yourself a question you didn't quite know how to finish? I read every comment on this channel, and what you share helps me know exactly who I'm making these videos for and what the follow-up needs to cover. So tell me your situation right now before we go any further, because what's coming in this video was built for the parent who asked that question and never got a real answer. Here is where the brain data starts, and it starts somewhere that surprises almost everyone. The first thing researchers wanted to understand was not whether daycare was good or bad for development. That framing, it turns out, is too broad to be useful and too loaded to be accurate. What the most rigorous studies began asking instead was a much more specific question. What are the conditions in any care environment that are neurologically meaningful for a developing infant? And what are the conditions that are neurologically neutral or neurologically costly? The landmark reference point for this line of research is the NICHD study of early childcare, funded by the National Institutes of Health, which tracked more than 1,300 children across the first several years of life, examining in extraordinary detail what different care environments were actually doing to measurable developmental outcomes. It was not a short study. It ran for years. It involved direct observation, cortisol sampling, cognitive assessment, language tracking, and attachment evaluation. And what it found disrupted almost every simple narrative that existed about daycare at the time. The quality of the care environment, whether that environment was home or a center, predicted outcomes far more strongly than the location of that care. The type of place mattered far less than what was happening inside it. That sounds straightforward, but follow what it actually means in practice, because the implications go deeper than they appear. A high-quality daycare center, by the measures the researchers defined, could produce developmental outcomes that were indistinguishable from, and in certain specific domains, measurably better than, home care environments that were lower in interaction quality, language exposure, and responsiveness. And the reverse was equally true. The brain does not care whether the room it is developing in has a sign on the door that says home or a sign that says daycare. It cares about the neurological inputs it is receiving inside that room. And those inputs are defined by things that are far more specific and far more within a parent's influence than where the baby spends Tuesday afternoon. Nadia was 28 years old and had a 7-month-old named Eli when she found herself sitting in the parking lot of a daycare center, unable to go inside, crying in a way she described as not quite grief and not quite guilt, but something between the two. She had done everything right by any external standard. The center had a 5-star state rating. The caregiver ratio was excellent. The director had been in early childhood education for 19 years. And Nadia still could not make herself believe that leaving Eli there for 8 hours was something a nervous system could simply absorb without consequence. What nobody had told Nadia, what I want to tell you right now, is that her question was real, and her instinct was pointing at something real. But what her instinct was pointing at was not what she thought it was. She wasn't asking whether daycare was safe. She knew it was safe. What she was actually asking was a neurological question that she didn't have the vocabulary for yet. Is the environment Eli is about to spend 8 hours in going to give his nervous system what it needs to do what it is trying to do right now? That is the right question, and it has a specific, science-backed answer. I'll come back to Nadia and what she eventually discovered when she started looking at it through that lens in a few minutes. But first, I need to show you the finding that changes this entire picture, because it involves something called cortisol elevation in the daycare context, and it is the most misunderstood piece of research in this entire space. Now that you've heard what the NICHD data showed about care quality, I want to ask you something while this is fresh. Have you ever noticed that your baby seems different when they come home? Not upset, exactly, but something, like a version of themselves that is slightly more fragile, more clingy, harder to settle, even on days when everything reportedly went fine. If you've seen that, drop it in the comments. Describe it. Because what I'm about to show you is the neurological explanation for exactly that pattern. And it is not what most parenting sites are telling parents when they try to look it up. This is the part that reframes everything. Here is what almost nobody in mainstream parenting content explains clearly about the daycare cortisol research. And getting it wrong leads parents to either panic unnecessarily or miss something genuinely important. A series of studies conducted across the early 2000s, including work published in the journal Early Childhood Research Quarterly, and a frequently cited study from researchers at the University of Washington, found that a significant proportion of infants and toddlers in center-based care showed elevated cortisol levels across the day, meaning their stress hormone increased from morning to afternoon, while children in home care, whether with a parent or a caregiver, showed the typical pattern of cortisol declining across the day. That finding made headlines. It alarmed parents. It was used by various commentators as evidence that daycare was neurologically damaging. But here is the piece that almost always gets left out. The cortisol elevation pattern was not universal across daycare settings. It was strongly correlated with specific features of the care environment. And when researchers examined which features predicted the elevated pattern, the list was highly specific. Low caregiver responsiveness, high child-to-adult ratios, limited individual interaction time, and high ambient noise and stimulation levels. And when those features were controlled for, when the research isolated high-quality center care with responsive caregivers, lower ratios, and predictable interaction, the cortisol elevation pattern diminished substantially or disappeared. What the data was measuring was not the daycare location. It was the quality of co-regulation available to the infant in that environment. Your baby's cortisol system in the first year of life does not have the architecture to regulate itself. You already know this if you've watched any of my previous videos. The stress hormone system requires an external regulator, a responsive, attuned adult, to return to baseline when it becomes activated. In a setting where that external regulator is stretched across too many children or is not trained in the specific responsiveness cues of your individual baby, the system stays elevated longer than it would otherwise. This is not a condemnation of daycare. It is a description of a biological requirement. And understanding that requirement changes what you look for, what questions you ask, and what you can do, regardless of which care environment your baby is in. Your baby's brain is not making a moral judgment about where it is. It is asking a single neurological question every hour of every day. Is a regulated, responsive adult available to co-regulate with me when I need it? That is the question. Everything else, the toys, the curriculum, the music, the decor, is secondary to the answer to that question. When Nadia finally understood this framing, she said it shifted everything. Not because it solved the logistics of her situation. She still had to go back to work. Eli still spent 8 hours a day at the center. What changed was what she paid attention to when she visited, and what she looked for when she observed the caregiver interactions, and what she did in the 2 hours each evening when Eli was with her. She stopped trying to compensate for the hours she wasn't there by maximizing stimulation, enrichment activities, and educational content. She started doing what the research actually says matters most in those hours: predictable, low stimulation, high responsiveness interaction. Following his lead, sitting close, narrating what he was doing, letting him regulate back down after a full day of environmental activation. She told me, about 4 weeks into trying this, that Eli's evenings changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show up on a video, but the quality of his settling was different. The fragile, hard-to-reach version of him that came home every afternoon started arriving home a little softer. She had not changed the daycare, she had changed the co-regulation environment available to him in the hours she did have. Here is what that means in practical terms, and I want to be specific because vague guidance doesn't help anyone who is actually managing this in real life. The first thing the research consistently supports is what I'd call the re-entry window. The 30 to 45 minutes immediately after pickup or after the workday ends at home are neurologically significant for your baby. After a full day in any care environment, the infant nervous system is in a state of accumulated activation, not necessarily distress, but heightened. What it needs in that window is not more input, not more stimulation, not more activity. It needs a predictable, calm, physically close interaction with its primary caregiver. Even 15 minutes of sitting on the floor together, following your baby's lead with your phone face down, produces a measurable shift in physiological state. Research from the Institute of Child Development at the University of Minnesota suggests that the quality of this re-entry interaction predicts evening regulation outcomes better than the number of hours the baby spent in care that day. The second thing is knowing how to read the activation signals your baby gives you during that window. A baby who comes home and immediately escalates, clingy, inconsolable, hard to settle, is not being manipulative. They are completing a biological arc that the day interrupted. They were managing, adapting, functioning, and now the external regulator they trust most is available. The nervous system is using that availability to discharge what it accumulated. The instinct to stop that process, to distract, to entertain, to redirect, works against the physiology. The instinct to stay close, to hold, to let it move through, works with it. The third thing, and this is the one that surprises parents most, is that the research does not support the assumption that more time automatically means better outcomes. What it supports is consistent high-quality responsiveness during the time that exists. A parent who spends 4 hours a day with an infant, but is present, regulated, and responsive during those 4 hours, is providing something neurologically different from a parent who is physically present for 10 hours, but distracted, depleted, and emotionally unavailable for most of them. Time is the container. What matters is what you put inside it. The most common mistake parents make when they learn this, and I see it constantly, is using it to justify guilt in either direction. Daycare parents hear the cortisol data and feel they have confirmed their worst fear. Home care parents hear the quality data and feel either vindicated or newly anxious about their own responsiveness. Neither reaction is useful. Both miss the point. The point is this: your baby's brain is extraordinarily adaptive. It is built to develop across a wide range of care environments. What it requires in any of those environments is not perfection. It is not constant stimulation. It is not a specific location or a specific schedule. It requires the experience, repeated reliably, that a regulated and responsive adult is available to help it return to baseline when the world becomes too much. You are that adult. Whether you have 4 hours a day or 12, whether your baby is in a center, with a nanny, with a grandparent, or home with you full-time. The neurological question your baby is asking does not change based on the logistics. It changes based on what you bring when you show up. A year from now, your baby will not remember whether they were in daycare or not. What the research says they will carry in the architecture of a nervous system that is still being calibrated by these early experiences is a template for what relationships feel like, whether they are predictable, whether regulated adults arrive when they are needed, whether the world is a place that responds. That template is built in the hours you have, not the hours you don't. Think about the parent you were before you watched this video versus the parent you are right now, in this moment, holding this information. The question you were asking before was probably, am I making the right choice? The question you can ask now is more useful, more specific, and far more within your control. Am I giving my baby's nervous system what it needs in the time I have? That is a question you can answer, tonight, without changing a single logistical thing about your life. Before I go, is there a moment you can think of when you came home to your baby after a long day and something shifted between you in a way that you didn't have language for before? A moment that you now see differently? I'd love to know what that looks like for you. Drop it in the comments. If someone in your life is carrying guilt about this question right now, and you know exactly who I mean, send them this video today, not as a reassurance, as information. The thing that lifts guilt that was never warranted isn't kindness. It's science. Give them the science. In my next video, I'm going to show you what researchers at Harvard's Center on the Developing Child documented about the specific type of adult interaction that builds what they call serve and return neural architecture, and why it matters more in the first 18 months than any enrichment activity, educational toy, or language program available. The algorithm won't reliably show it to you if you're not, and this one builds directly on what you just learned. The next time you pick up your baby from wherever they spent their day, and you hold them close and let them settle into you, I want you to know what is actually happening in that moment. Their nervous system is finding its reference point. You are the reference point. You always were. That is what the brain data has been saying all along.